Washington, D.C., 1969. A mail truck is moving through the city. Early morning, routine run. The driver has made this trip 100 times. He is carrying bags of old, worn-out currency from the Federal Reserve to the Treasury Department, where the bills will be counted, recorded, and destroyed. Dead money. Bills so worn they are being taken out of circulation. Not fresh stacks with crisp serial numbers. Wrinkled, faded, beaten-up cash that the government has decided is no longer fit to use. The kind of money nobody is supposed to want, because in a few hours it will not exist anymore. 3 men step into the road. Their faces are covered in ash. Dark gray smudges rubbed across their skin like war paint. One of them is dressed like a postal worker. They stop the truck. They approach the driver, and they take $382,000 in currency that was on its way to be burned. But here is the detail that separates this robbery from every other robbery in the history of Washington, D.C. One of the men looks at the driver, and he says something that nobody in that driver's position has ever heard before. This money is for needy black kids. Then he gives the driver an instruction. Tell the police the robbers were white. He pauses, changes his mind. Tell them some brothers robbed you, and they all look alike. $382,000. Ash on their faces. A mail truck full of money the government was about to destroy. And a line delivered to the driver that sounds like it belongs in a movie. 26 years later, it will be in a movie. One of the most powerful black films of the 90s. A film that will star Lorenz Tate, Chris Tucker, and Keith David. A film directed by the same 2 brothers who made Menace to Society. The film will be called Dead Presidents, and it will be based on this man. But the film will change things. It will add violence he never committed. It will invent a war scene he never lived. It will give his character a tragic ending that sends him to prison as the credits roll and the screen goes black. And the real man, watching the film in a theater in 1995, will lean back in his seat and say 5 words that tell you more than the entire movie does. The movie ends where my life begins. Because what happened after the robbery, after the conviction, after the prison cell, is a story Hollywood did not have the imagination to tell. A robber who became an inmate leader who testified before the United States Congress, a convict who was invited to the White House by the President of the United States. The film gave you the fall. This is the rise that came after it. This is the story of Haywood T. Kirkland, the real man behind Dead Presidents. This is that story. Start with Vietnam, because that is where everything breaks. Haywood Kirkland grows up in the Bronx, a working-class black family in a working-class neighborhood in a country that is about to ask young men like him to do something their country will never fully repay them for. By the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War is consuming a generation, and the generation it is consuming disproportionately is black. In 1967, black soldiers make up 11% of the American population, but nearly 25% of the combat casualties in Vietnam. They are dying at more than twice their proportion of the population, and the men who are sending them have no plan for what happens when they come home. Kirkland goes to Vietnam. He serves. He sees the things that every man who went to that war saw, and that none of them were prepared to see. The jungle, the fear, the friends who were there in the morning and gone by afternoon, the confusion of fighting a war that half the country at home has decided is wrong while you are still in the middle of it. And for black soldiers, the war carries an extra weight. They are fighting for a country that, back home, will not let them drink from the same water fountains as the men standing next to them in the foxhole. They are defending democracy in Southeast Asia, while their families back in the Bronx and Baltimore and Birmingham are still marching for the right to vote. The contradiction is not abstract. It is specific. It is daily. It is the knowledge that the man beside you in the squad would not be allowed to sit beside you in a restaurant in Mississippi. Kirkland comes home, and the country that sent him does not want him back. This is not an exaggeration. This is documented. After World War II, the GI Bill transformed the lives of millions of white veterans. Free college, home loans, business loans, a pathway into the middle class that built the American suburbs. But black veterans were systematically denied access to the same benefits. Banks would not approve their home loans. Colleges in the South would not admit them. Veterans Administration hospitals were segregated. The promise of the GI Bill was, for black veterans, a broken promise delivered with a handshake and a flag. And by the time Vietnam veterans started coming home in the late 60s and early 70s, even that broken promise had dried up. There was no parade. There was no thank you. There was a country that was angry at the war itself and took that anger out on the men who fought it. Protesters spat on returning soldiers. Employers looked at a veteran's resume and saw a liability, not a hero. And the Veterans Administration, already failing to serve World War II and Korean War veterans, was completely overwhelmed by the flood of young men coming back from Southeast Asia with wounds the system did not know how to treat. Post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1969, the term does not exist. What exists is a generation of young black men who cannot sleep, who flinch at loud noises, who rage at things that do not deserve rage, who drink to quiet the noise in their heads, who sit in apartments in the Bronx and wonder why they survived a war 10,000 miles away, only to come home and discover that survival was the easy part. Haywood Kirkland is one of those men, and in 1969, broke, angry, carrying a war in his chest that nobody around him can see or understand, he makes a decision. The mail truck. Here is what you have to understand about the target Kirkland chose, because it tells you something about the man that the movie completely misses. He did not rob a bank. He did not rob a store. He did not rob a person on the street. He robbed a mail truck carrying money that the United States government had already decided to destroy. Dead money. Worn-out bills on their way to a furnace. Currency that in a few hours would not exist. Kirkland and his two partners took money that was, in the government's own assessment, worthless. Money that was not going to pay anybody's salary or fund anybody's school or build anybody's road. Money that was headed for a fire. And when he told the driver it was for needy black kids, he was not performing. He was not delivering a line. He was telling the man what he believed, that the money the government was about to burn could feed children the government had decided not to feed, that the country he had fought for overseas was burning cash while the neighborhoods he came home to were burning from neglect. $382,000. Three men, ash on their faces, like the war paint of soldiers who had already fought one war and were now fighting another one, this time against the country that sent them to the first. They got away clean, for a while. And then, the way it always works, they did not. Kirkland was caught, he was convicted, and he was sent to the Lorton Correctional Complex in Virginia, a sprawling, overcrowded facility that at its peak held thousands of inmates from the District of Columbia, a place that was itself a kind of war zone, with its own hierarchies, its own violence, its own rules of survival that had nothing to do with the ones the courts imposed. And here is where the movie stops. In Dead Presidents, the character based on Kirkland, Anthony Curtis, played by Lorenz Tate, is sentenced to 15 years to life. He throws a chair at the judge. The bus pulls away. The screen goes black. The credits roll. That is where Hollywood leaves him, in a prison bus, heading to a cell. End of story. But Haywood Kirkland's story does not end on a prison bus. It begins there. Because inside Lorton, something happens that the Hughes brothers did not film, that Hollywood did not imagine, and that the audience never got to see. Kirkland becomes a leader, not a gang leader, not a block boss, a leader. Inside the facility, he organizes, he advocates, he speaks for men who cannot speak for themselves, men who are locked up and forgotten, men who served their country the same way he did and came home the same way he did and ended up in the same place he did. He becomes an advocate for incarcerated veterans, a voice inside the walls for men who fought in Vietnam, in Korea, in World War II, who came home and found themselves behind bars because the country that sent them to war had no plan for what happened after. And his voice is loud enough that it reaches outside the walls. Haywood Kirkland testifies before the United States Congress. From inside, a prison, a convicted robber, a Vietnam veteran, an inmate at Lorton, sitting in front of elected officials and telling them the truth about what happens to veterans who are locked up, about the lack of mental health resources, about the lack of rehabilitation, about the fact that the men inside those walls fought for the flag that is hanging behind the committee members' chairs and were rewarded with cells instead of services. Congress listens. And then something happens that should be the climax of a movie, except the movie had already ended 2 reels too early. President Jimmy Carter invites Haywood Kirkland to the White House. The White House. The man who robbed a mail truck with ash on his face and told the driver the money was for needy black kids is invited to the home of the President of the United States. Because the work he did from inside a prison, the advocacy, the testimony, the organizing, was valuable enough that the leader of the free world wanted to hear from him directly. A mail truck robber in the White House, sitting in the same building where the decisions that sent him to Vietnam were made, talking to the man who inherited the mess those decisions created. That is the arc the movie does not show you. Robber to inmate to advocate to congressional witness to White House guest. A trajectory so improbable that if you pitched it to a screenwriter, they would say it was too much. Nobody would believe it. But it happened. It is documented. It is in the public record. The man who stole $382,000 in dead money with ash on his face stood in the White House and told the president what was wrong with the system that put him inside. And then, in 1995, Hollywood came calling, Albert and Alan Hughes. The same 2 brothers who had directed Menace to Society 2 years earlier, a film that redefined black cinema and launched careers and shook audiences in a way few films had before. The same directors who had hired real Crips to provide security on that film. The same directors who had the Hacienda Bloods show up and bring real conflict to their set. The same directors who fired Tupac from above the rim and had him come back with his fists. The Hughes brothers were 21 when they made Menace. They were 23 when they made Dead Presidents. And they were drawn to Kirkland's story because it was the other half of the same coin they had already been examining. Menace was about young black men trapped in a cycle of violence in South Central. Dead Presidents was about young black men trapped in a cycle of violence that started in a jungle 10,000 miles away and followed them home. Same system, same failure, different zip code. The Hughes Brothers found Kirkland's story in a book, Bloods, an oral history of the Vietnam War by black veterans, by a journalist named Wallace Terry. Terry had been the first black editor-in-chief of an Ivy League newspaper at Brown University. He had landed a Time magazine cover story in 1967 called The Negro in Vietnam, and he had spent years collecting the testimonies of black soldiers, their experiences during the war and after. Kirkland's chapter stood out: the robbery, the ash, the $382,000. The quote about needy black kids, the whole thing read like a movie. So they made one. Dead Presidents was released on October the 6th, 1995, 10 days before the Million Man March in Washington, D.C. The timing was not planned, but it was perfect. A film about black men abandoned by their country, released the same month a million black men gathered in the nation's capital to demand recognition. Larenz Tate played the character based on Kirkland. Chris Tucker, in his breakout dramatic role before Friday made him a comedy star, played a veteran who came home addicted and could not find his way back. Keith David played the older mentor. Terrence Howard, in one of his earliest roles, played a pool hall regular. Bokeem Woodbine played the religious soldier. A cast of actors who would each go on to become major names assembled for a film that told the story of men America sent to war and then forgot. The film grossed over $24 million. And Haywood Kirkland, who by then had changed his name to Ari Sesu Merretazon, watched the movie in a theater. He saw his robbery turned into a different robbery. He saw his war turned into a different war. He saw violence added that he had never committed. He saw a character given a tragic ending that he, the real man, had long since moved past. And he told the Washington Post 5 words that sit on top of this entire story like a crown. The movie ends where my life begins. Think about what that means. Hollywood took the worst moment of his life, the robbery, the ash, the handcuffs, and made it the whole story. They filmed the fall and called it a movie. They put the credits after the prison bus and let the audience walk out of the theater believing that was the end. But the real man is sitting in the theater knowing that the end they showed is actually the beginning, that everything meaningful he ever did, the leadership, the advocacy, the testimony before Congress, the invitation to the White House, happened after the scene where the movie stops. The film showed a man destroyed by a system. The real man rebuilt himself inside that system and then stood in front of the people who run it and told them how to fix it. And Merretazon was honest about what the movie got wrong. He told the Post he never took a life. He never committed the violence the film depicted. He was expecting to see something he could recognize. Instead, he saw a dramatized version that took his robbery and wrapped it in a story that was not his. But he did not complain, because the movie, for all its inventions, did one thing right. It showed America what happens to black veterans who come home from war and find nothing waiting for them. It showed the emptiness, the rage, the desperation, the feeling of having given everything to a country that gives nothing back. That part was true. And that part was Kirkland's, even if the details around it were Hollywood's. So what do you take from the life of Haywood T. Kirkland? Take the quote, "The movie ends where my life begins. A man went to Vietnam. He came home broken. He robbed a mail truck with ash on his face and told the driver the money was for needy black kids. He went to prison. And then inside that prison, he became something the country that locked him up never expected. A leader, a voice, a man who testified before Congress and shook the president's hand and spent the second half of his life trying to fix the system that swallowed the first half. Hollywood saw the robbery and made a movie. The real man saw the movie and said, "You missed the whole point. The fall is not the story. The fall is where the story starts." $382,000, ash on his face. A quote about needy black kids, a prison cell, a congressional hearing, a White House invitation, and 5 words that every filmmaker in America should be required to hear before they turn a real man's life into a 2-hour entertainment. The movie ends where my life begins.